Good afternoon, Yvonne, Sahir. It's nice to meet you in person. Do you want to do a quick background a little bit on your role at MongoDB and at Puppet, and we'll get started?
Sure, no problem. So I run product management at Mongo. I joined the company about 3.5 years ago to drive the sort of evolution of the company from an enterprise open source company to really being a cloud services platform. So it's been a busy few years.
Great.
So Yvonne, CEO at Puppet. I've been at Puppet for a little over 9 months. Background, 17 years at Accenture, a good chunk of time at VMware and New Relic, small drone analytics company, and super excited to be at Puppet in part because of what Paul was just talking about, the power of open source and the whole move into containers and multi-cloud. It's an exciting time.
It is exciting. Let's talk about market segmentation. And so we hear a lot of cloud-first strategies and cloud-native product acquisitions for organizations. I'm the CIO at a bank. We're 36 years old. We've got a lot of legacy systems and applications, but we do have a cloud-first strategy where we try and adopt native software as a service and now building infrastructure as a service. But how do you think about market segmentation? What are the markets that are adopting your products and solutions more quickly? What are the ones that are more challenging to sell into? So I'll open that up to maybe Yvonne first.
Absolutely. It's because Puppet's an open source at its base. The way that I think about the marketplace is, we've been around for over 10 years, there's tens of thousands of organizations that use Puppet open source very, very successfully. When I think about who do we sell to and who buys the commercial product, that typically is the large complex enterprise. And those are the companies where stitching together all the things that you need with an open source infrastructure automation product doesn't make sense. They're a payments company, they're a financial institution, they're a logistics company. And what we've seen from an expansion standpoint is really around what you were leading to, the multi-cloud world. So initially, a lot of our customers will say, hey, exactly what you said, we're cloud first, but we're not cloud only. We have got applications that are going to die in the data center. This is particularly true for a lot of the large banks and financial institutions, but we saw the chart earlier. There's 7 to 10% of the workloads in the cloud. There's a lot still in the data center. We're moving as much as we can to the public cloud. Oftentimes that'll be a containerized VM, and we're building out net new in containers. And so what we've done at Puppet is really look at how do we extend our base. Started off as configuration management, but have really built out a multi-cloud platform, and then on top of that have put use cases. So configuration management is one of them, but now we've added on compliance and reporting, we've added on continuous delivery, we've added on incident remediation or vulnerability remediation, and so we're putting the use cases on top, which really allows us to bring a higher value proposition to those companies who at the end of the day, they don't want 50,000 solutions. They want a set of partners that they can rely on over time.
Great. Thank you, Sahir.
Yeah, so for MongoDB, being similar to Puppet, being open source, our product is adopted in a pretty agnostic way, whether you're a large bank or enterprise, all the way down to innovative startups, SMBs, mid-market customers, and it's actually quite global as well. But prior to the company really focusing on a SaaS strategy, our monetization was largely focused on complicated enterprise, similar to what Yvonne was talking about with Puppet. And that's where they needed our proprietary technology around managing MongoDB, around enterprise support of the technology should they need help if something goes wrong. And that's still a very important part of our monetization strategy and is growing quite aggressively. But over the last 3 years, a big part of our focus has been how do we monetize the entire opportunity for MongoDB, no matter where it's adopted, no matter what size of customer. And the two things that are really different with our cloud products is it's allowed us to really nail product market fit for monetization all the way down kind of the long tail. So enterprise all the way to startups with a couple people in a garage getting started. And also it's allowed us to expand on a single application where Traditionally, we would be monetizing in an enterprise only when an application would get to production. Now we're monetizing everything from that initial prototype and inception all the way through development into testing and into production. So it's really expanded our sort of addressable monetization opportunity, even though Mongo itself has always been used as an open source database and the entirety of that segmentation. And that's had, besides the product changes, I think the more interesting impact for us has been how it's had to evolve our go-to-market strategy and really building up a bottoms-up B2C product-led model that Dharmesh was talking about that hits the volume base, up to scaling our inside sales motion, which is much more around high-velocity market acquisition, and then certainly shifting the enterprise over to be a hybrid model between enterprise software on-prem and SaaS service in the cloud.
Fantastic. Let's drill in a little more about market segmentation, whether you're domestic, whether you're global. We hear about all the different laws, rules, and regulations that are impacting us, whether it's being generated out of the EU with GDPR, and now you've got California with a new privacy law going into effect in January, plus all of the cybersecurity risks that we hear about on an ongoing basis. What types of conversations do you have with your clients based on the segments that they're in and where they want to do business? What kind of questions do they ask you pertaining to those types of security and privacy type risks? Sahir, you want to start?
So, historically, security has always been kind of a big focus area for a database, right? We're storing potentially personal identifiable information, confidential business information. But in a world where a customer is managing whether our open source software or our commercial software themselves, there's only a certain amount of focus and attention they're gonna put on us. And it's really about features and capabilities in the product itself. But now that we're really more of a cloud-first organization, that dynamic becomes much more front and center in every conversation especially in large organizations. So we've had to really scale up our security and compliance organizations in a big way. We've had to change some of our engineering practices to make sure that mutable logging and all this stuff is sort of happening all the time so that we can build the trust when we go ask a customer to ultimately hand over control of their database environment to us. And given it's crucial data and it's in the kind of path of criticality for an application, we go through a lot of scrutiny around that. So there's a lot around just kind of core fundamentals, compliance, and security. The second side is in the cloud, given a big part of our value proposition is scaling a global application, across multiple geographies. The question around how we make sure that data doesn't leave a particular geography for data sovereignty is a big one. And it happens to be an advantage for our technology, so it's been a tailwind to our business, not a headwind. But it is a hot topic, especially in Europe, and as you mentioned, increasing in Australia it's a big deal right now, California with what they're doing. So I think those are kind of the two pockets.
Thanks to hear, Yvonne.
Yeah, I would say, very similar. Puppet's a global company, and I think we have benefited from selling into very regulated industries for a long time. So a lot of the new laws and requirements, we were being held to a higher standard already. But I will say, the way that we approach it is very much from, an appreciation that there is going to be a higher level of focus on security. So we've done a lot on that front to ensure that we're driving a top gold standard on that, on data privacy as well. And I think for us, the current conversation we've got going on, particularly as we build out more SaaS-based products, is really, and we've got a lot of telemetry, is really around, what are you doing with the data? And I think, there's been some, interesting press around how are you analyzing the data when you look to enter into machine learning and AI, how are you doing that? How are you anonymizing things? How can you be accountable to your customers with what you're doing or not? And so I think a lot of the current dialogue that we have at Puppet is as we build out that next generation on our roadmap, that we're just being really, really thoughtful of what's important and stay on the right side of these large companies.
Yeah, SVB is in a highly regulated industry, and our examiners come in on an ongoing basis and ask us about how we're adopting these technologies, how are we balancing the risk of security and privacy with technology enablement. And so it's an ongoing discussion, and a lot of the times is your regulators are learning as part of that journey. Let's shift gears and talk about community. Both of you have developed amazing, fantastic communities. You've got huge fans all around the world. How do you leverage the positive momentum that you've developed with those communities, and how do you generate that into sales and growth for your organizations? So start with Yvonne.
Yeah, it's interesting when people often talk about open source in one dimension, and at Puppet we really look at it across 3 different dimensions. So we think about the open source development of the tools themselves, and how much are we sponsoring from a Puppet perspective versus what's done with the community. We have the content that runs through those tools, which in our case is oftentimes also open source. And then we have the people who benefited from it who may or may not be contributing. And so when we look at developing the community, we look at how are we meeting the needs and value propositions for all of those audiences so that we maintain a good balance across. And it's really important as you think about open source and the evolution of open source to realize that the market is moving. And so Puppet open source project has been around for over a decade. It's very, very mature. We still have great level of contributions. 75% of our commits across our open source projects are still from the community, so a lot of involvement. But there's an increasing, we did a contributor summer, the increasing amount of involvement is actually on our newer projects, like Bolt and Lyra and Wash. We ourselves are upstream contributors to Tekton at Google, and so part of how we've been able to continue to grow a really healthy community from a developer of the tool perspective is really around keeping up to date with how that market is shifting, not being stuck in the ways of the old, but really continuing to extend and progress. Particularly the rise of foundations and all that, you really have to be thoughtful on how are you getting mind share, how are you making it interesting. From a content and usage perspective, we just did our big user conference. It's really important for people to feel the benefit. So we've had large enterprise customers who will leave these conferences, clean up code, post it to the Forge, because they're so encouraged by giving back. I think there's a natural human satisfaction in helping the broader set. And so what we try to do is create those opportunities where people who are leveraging content can also give back and create things from a healthy perspective. So we're always very thankful for the people who support us, and we look at it very much as a collaboration.
Feels good to be part of a community.
Yeah.
Sahir?
Yeah, so I think going back to the early days of MongoDB and a lot of the foundations, certainly that Max had a big part in building, was driven by an intense focus on the community. I mean, we came out with a completely different style of database at a time when that was definitely not par for the course. So convincing developers to even try something new was a big part of the drumbeat of just the bottoms-up grassroots adoption that we needed to build. And that certainly led to this sort of like worldwide adoption of the database amongst developers worldwide, which continues through today. But then there was sort of a phase in the company's evolution where a lot of our go-to-market investments were focused on finding those applications that had already been built on MongoDB and finding the enterprise organizations that would get value from our commercial software and all of that and upselling them into paying customers. And largely speaking, that's still a somewhat important part of our motion for the enterprise software side, but I think it's less of a dependency than it used to be, whether somebody's using Mongo already or not, because now we've sort of trained our sales organization to sell much higher in an organization, to open up the doors, to get access to the developers, whether they've already used Mongo or not. So that's kind of one piece of the dynamic. Now, with the shift of the business towards cloud, there's a much more direct link between the users being our actual buyers, as Dharmesh mentioned in the intro earlier. So we've really almost reinvested back into a lot of the community dev relations around broad-based, developer marketing. We do 22 user conferences for MongoDB, and then we sponsor another 30 or something for the cloud providers to really make sure we're constantly building that base of bottoms-up adoption, because we know it's either going to feed our revenue stream now or it's going to feed it 5 years from now. It's always going to be an important piece of the puzzle for us. And for us, the other side of it is, we actually do develop the vast majority of the code that goes into our database, even though there are contributions. But we view the part that's open source as crucially as anything we sell in a proprietary way, whether it be a commercial software or our SaaS service. And the biggest piece of engineering development feature-wise we had over the last 3 years cost us probably $40 million, and it goes into the free version of the product. So we really do, from an investment standpoint, it's not like everything goes to the monetization angle. We really need to make sure that open source technology and that community edition is really powerful.
That's great. And you talked a little bit about the go-to-market strategy. Let's focus in on that. You both have got great communities that you've cultivated over the years, and the participants are your great advocates. How do you formulate that into a go-to-market strategy, and do you differentiate it with the actual product strategy for your organizations? And we'll start with you, Yvonne.
It's a great question. I'd say the answer has evolved as Puppet has grown and matured. And so I think similar to many young companies, technology companies, you're typically selling to the user of the technology. And so at that point in time, feature functionality is really important. The technology itself is really important. A lot of the community events are really important to get people engaged in using the technology. And you sponsor those types of events. Maybe you send out T-shirts or whatever it is, but you're looking to get to that end user. And what's interesting as you grow and scale over time, and it was mentioned early on in the opening, is as you grow as a company in the enterprise space, you need to maintain that. I mean, those are the people who love you. Those are the people who have skills in your technology who will bring you in. But you have to start selling higher. And what we found at Puppet is we had to make a transition from selling technology and feature function to selling use cases that solve business problems. And so we had to make a fundamental shift in how we articulate what we do, because we have that developer love at the bottom, but we needed to be able to reach higher to get to the true business impact we could have in large enterprise. And the other shift that really our customers have been begging us to do, and we're finally responding to, is early on, the people who use your technology, oftentimes are better than your teams themselves. They're the mad scientists who want all the knobs and the switches, and they want to configure it in 50,000 ways. The number one request that I get is make Puppet simpler. Don't give me 50 ways to use Puppet. Give me one. Give me the one that's going to solve my business problem. And so what you'll see coming out from Puppet is on the Forge, there's over 6,000 modules. Now we're starting to create curated ways that if you want to use Puppet to automate the Windows environment, here's the modules you want, here's the training you want. And so we've made a big shift in how we actually approach the go-to-market. But it's very much tied to the age of the company and where we sell. And so we're working very hard to kind of say, hey, from a development standpoint, in the open source space, you can do what you want. From a product kind of communication standpoint, we now have 2 layers that we communicate on. We've got a community development team, but we've got kind of the business-focused, account-based marketing approach. From a product roadmap perspective, we're really focusing on being more prescriptive, allowing some turning of knobs, but not making that the only way you engage in Puppet. And the final thing I'll say, and we started doing this years ago, but just from my broader experience, security and reliability are 2 of the top feature requests of your large enterprise customers. And I think sometimes in tech companies, it's hard for the engineering teams to understand how important those are. But the more successful you are in enterprise, the more important it is to balance out the net new feature functionality with security, reliability, scalability that are equally important, particularly when you're selling higher up. The individual using your technology may not care as much, but the person higher up does, and they want it to integrate into their broader environment.
Yeah, the very technology that is empowering us may also imperil us, and how do you balance that out?
Yeah.
To you, Sahir, how about you when you think about go-to-market strategy, product strategy?
So, I think the big product strategy shift for us was really from, commercial software, proprietary technology on top of our open source community version, shifting more to a SaaS model. And at this point, I think we're well past the tipping point where the SaaS business will be the larger percentage of the pie, and we've shifted a lot of our product development to being cloud first, or in some cases cloud only, and products we'll only manage and run ourselves. So we've kind of walked through that transition. On the go-to-market side, it's been probably even more complicated. So 3 years ago, it was really, and I touched a little bit about this earlier, was around moving from most of our revenue being concentrated in large enterprises to a model where, and at that time, I think our customer count was probably in the like 500 or 600 customers because it was a high-touch model selling to large enterprise. Certainly the team was smaller too, but it was quite concentrated. But with the cloud product now, I think we're somewhere around 15, 16,000 customers and 1 million free users on our cloud product. So it's really diversified our monetization and customer base in quite a big way. And a lot of those customers are not engaging with us in a 300K enterprise sales rep kind of motion. We've got sort of junior inside sales reps that have more of a customer success mentality versus a sales mentality. We've got a large volume self-service business, which we've really built an integrated performance marketing, content marketing function that's much more B2C style in the way they engage with our end users versus traditional B2B. So we've been spending a lot of time really kind of optimizing and building each of those muscles such that we have a much more diverse go-to-market strategy today than we did 3.5, 4 years ago. But the next phase of the journey for us is really understanding how a customer or a user kind of moves between those models. Because what we found is the traditional segmentation of saying, we're going to put the expensive reps on the big brand name accounts with large IT spend and put no reps on the small customers is way too simplistic for how big our market is and just the journey that customers go through. And as an example, we have customers that come in through our self-service channel, and then as they mature and want discounting, better enterprise terms or whatnot, they get upsold by our sales organization. Pretty obvious, kind of bottoms up, added with sales. But we also have the opposite. We have customers that don't come in through the marketing funnel, don't convert on a credit card, but are outbound, pipeline generated by the sales organization that may start with a committed contract the first time they engage with us, and then say, you know what, I really don't need the commitment. I love the product. I'm just going to go pay as you go. And they go into the self-service channel. And we have, small companies that if you just looked on number of employees or revenue, you'd think we should just cover over the phone from our, inside sales organization out of Austin, but are actually much better served with a, complicated field organization that can manage the complexities of that customer, because we can have a small company that's paying us well into the 7 figures. And yet we have the opposite, where we have a very laggard enterprise that it may not make sense to put a 300K rep on that account. We probably want self-service, account-based marketing to build that momentum in the account before we make that investment. So really understanding the overlaps and how users and customers flow through the different channels and the different customer-facing teams that we have is really, I think, where our biggest point of leverage going forward is. Because each of the individual engines themselves sort of have their best practices built out, and it's about scaling them. But now it's about how do we make sure the customers have a smooth transition between them and we're covering them appropriately.
Yeah, interesting. So a more bespoke customer service model. And so let's take the concept of community, which both of you have developed, and go-to-market strategy. And you need to drive commercial growth. How do you balance those out where you want to remain true to the organic, trust-based relationship that you've grown in your community, but you also have to grow your organizations? And so how do you balance both sort of the mindset and the philosophy and where you allocate resources? And I'll start with you, Yvonne.
Yeah. I think some of it comes down to, and again, I like what Paul said, we're an enterprise software company, and we use open source as a product development strategy. And very specifically when we do that, we're investing in the community as an extension of our R&D. We're investing in the community as an extension in our content development. And so while some companies, put out open source and they're doing the bulk of the work, we're sponsoring projects and we're contributing to other projects, but we're getting community involvement and development in that. So we really think about it as an extension of what we're doing, and so we treat it as such in terms of a priority to invest in and to ensure that there's relevance. And I would say at Puppet, it's part of the culture. If I were to all of a sudden mandate from up high that we were no longer going to be open source, probably half of my engineers would leave. It's a core part of why they contribute. It's a core value that we hold in terms of democratizing technology. And I talked a little bit earlier, part of how you stay engaged with that and you build that is you figure out how open source is evolving. And I do believe open source has shifted from being these big monolithic projects that you just put a little layer on top with some support, to being much more nuanced. So you have the foundations that have come out with the support from a lot of large enterprise. You have more contributions, even for Puppet ourselves. Contributing to Tecton as the first upstream development we've contributed to in a really significant way. Having smaller projects that are bleeding edge, some that will take off and be wildly successful and some that won't. We leverage other open source technology like Terraform and some of what we're building, particularly in the cloud native space. Our new cloud native commercial offering has our Bolt project in it, it has Terraform in it, it has Tecton in it. And so what we're doing from a commercial standpoint is looking at, if we're building technology in a democratized way at kind of the bottom, at kind of the core componentry level, it's really in our world, the large enterprise that's saying, hey, I could assemble all the pieces, but that's not my competitive differentiator. So I'm going to pay you to solve those business problems so I don't have to think about them. I want you to make the challenges of infrastructure invisible so that I can speed development on what really differentiates me as a company. And so from a commercial standpoint, what we do is we look at, starting with what are the business problems that our customers want solved, how do we go into the cupboard and figure out the right components of proprietary and open source, whether it's our own or others, and stitch it together in an integrated way that can be extensible over time. And so for us, it's been a very synergistic model where we, talk to our enterprise customers all the time about the value community brings to them. And, we talk to the community all the time around how we're committed to contributing and demonstrating that we're not, just taking what they're doing and not giving anything back, but we're making it a very healthy model where it's a win-win for everybody.
That's a great way to put it, a win-win scenario. Fantastic. Sahir, how about you guys at Mongo?
Yeah, I think it's similar. We don't really think of it as those two things as opposing forces that are in conflict. I mean, I think it's very well understood clearly at the executive team level inside of Mongo that if we don't foster the community, make sure we stay, true to our open source capabilities, continue to release open source functionality, that we won't have a business in the long term. So I think that that's a fundamental part of making sure that you're serving developers well. That's how development decisions from a bottoms up way get made is through that sense of community and open source. Now, I think what's evolved is the conflict of deciding what becomes commercially proprietary or open source. That's less of an issue now when most of our value will be delivered as a managed service going forward. And that's because of a combination of the value proposition itself being different when somebody's consuming a service where they just want the experts to handle the plumbing and they want to focus on differentiation, combined with, in our case, some very thoughtful licensing that makes sure that we can continue to open source all the best of our IP, drive that engine of adoption and community focus, but at the same time, build a large-scale, scalable, enterprise software franchise, that hopefully lasts for a long time. So I think it's gotten easier, if anything, as the companies transition to the cloud, but that does not mean that, we aren't also very, true to our open source roots.
Fantastic. We've talked about market segmentation, go-to-market strategy, building communities. How do you balance that out? And I'm sure our audience members are going to be interested in how you guys think about pricing, whether you have a fixed price, a pay-as-you-go. Does that perspective change depending on the size and maturity of the organization? And so help us think through what you think about how you price your products and services for your clients. So I'll open it to you first.
Yeah, pricing is probably one of the most challenging things to get right, kind of up there with sales comp if you have a large enterprise sales force, because it's interesting psychologically what you end up incenting at different places in the ecosystem and at different levels and different size deals. I think the best advice I ever got on pricing is looking at the value chain of what you're delivering and figuring out at what points on that value chain are you going to collect money for, and what's going to be the implication of that, and then how will it scale over time. So the simple example that I was taught is if you think about eBay, for example, do you charge an access price to the ecosystem, and then everything's free once you're there? Do you charge for things to be listed? Do you charge for things to be purchased? Do you charge for content and help that's away? And so if you think about that kind of ecosystem, all of a sudden you could say, wow, you are providing value in many, many different spots. But if you start charging money at any of them, you may actually prevent people from really scaling up the use of your technology. So when I apply that thinking to Puppet in our growing portfolio of offerings, we're at a point where we provide value through our open source content, through our open source tools, through our commercial products. We historically grew up in a node-centric world. We're moving into a container-based cloud world. And so I would say pricing is something in our world that we need to think about how we modernize over time. We currently price in a very node-centric way. But what's interesting is we have a large enterprise sales force, so you get to these large customers and everything becomes configurable. And oftentimes, the conversations that I'm in are really with what is the business value we're providing, and what is the right structure. And usually it's some type of ELA structure where you're incenting customers to use your technology and to proliferate it to ensure that they're getting the business value. But I would say it's an area where I've been at Puppet for 9 months. You'll probably see us focus on more going forward, because I don't think we've dialed it in perfectly as the market has shifted.
Thoughtful approach. Thanks for sharing that, Sahir.
Spend a lot of time on this these days internally. So, I think 7-10 years ago, there was a lot of talk about shifting from a perpetual software licensing model to a subscription software licensing model. And I was lucky and fortunate that MongoDB was already on a subscription software model for our enterprise software when I joined, because the idea of going from perpetual to a consumption-based model, which I'll get to in a minute, would probably be close to impossible. But I think there's been a few changes. On the software side of the house, we have a pretty simple pricing model. It was always just, a set of capacity, a set of servers you're running the database on, annual upfront contracts, maybe multi-year contracts if it makes sense for the customer and for us. And that's still, a model that served us well. The only real change is as private cloud technologies and containerization and all of that have become more pervasive, the idea of charging by the node versus just charging by an arbitrary pool of, memory capacity, which is kind of the big driver for database technology, was just a unit of measure change, so relatively simple. But on the cloud side of the house, as the slide earlier sort of showed, we are fully a consumption and usage-based model. So, the idea that we have to publish all of our unit prices, transparently, we meter the usage of the product. Somebody could spin up something for an hour or 10 minutes and, get charged for it, is fundamentally a very different thing than a subscription license. And I think we're just as an industry starting to figure out that consumption and usage-based metering is as different from subscription as subscription in some ways was from perpetual. And that's had huge knock-on effects in not only just where our engineering investment goes, but how we think about sales compensation. When the second you start to change the sales compensation to match usage instead of bookings and upfront contracts, and you're shifting customers from upfront payments to billing and arrears, that has financial implications. It has profile of the rep implications. So we're still, very much experimenting and changing the sales organization's engagement model with customers to really perfectly match that pay-as-you-go usage-based model. Because in a year or 2 years, where we'll be is a customer is just going to be making a commitment to Mongo across multiple products that they're going to ultimately consume and draw down from if they're willing to make a commitment at all. And then there'll be a big segment of the business that's just buying on a credit card or buying through PayPal where there's no commitment. And so that's had huge, huge implications across the organization, and everything from operations to finance to our sales organization, comp models. And I think we're probably 50% of the way through that. Now, the good thing for us is we have the inside sales organization in many ways is sort of our test bed. So we tune things, we try things. Ahead of that org, every 3 to 6 months, I've got some new harebrained idea to experiment with, and we've gotten pretty good at carving off a segment of risk-taking reps that really see the vision of the business, paying them differently, trying new models across operations and the sales org, seeing what works. so that we don't have one annual opportunity to take a big bet when we change sales comp. We're always running these go-to-market experiments, and it's almost like agile go-to-market, like as it is in the engineering side, where we're much more iterative around the way we make that change, which as a public company gives us a lot more confidence when we go and make a big sweeping change because we've proven out the unit economics and the sales motions and the backing technology that helps that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, just listening to Sahir talk, there are a couple things that I think are fundamental. So even though Puppet is predominantly an on-prem product today, though we do have some SaaS offerings, the company has always, well, it's been subscription for a very, very long time. And so building up the annual recurring revenue base is great, but even more important, you're building in that touch point with your customer. So you're going back and you're visiting with them. The big shift to your point, like to multi-year is a great thing in terms of, particularly if you have a harder product, to ensure that there's the time frame that they can get the value out of it and they can grow and scale. And I will say, similar to Sahir, we use our inside sales team also to do pricing experimentation and comp experimentation. And we have moved to even just how you think about the marketing of your pricing. And so, for example, we've got a product where we market it as a cost per month, even though you only can buy it in a 12-month subscription. But just that mindset of, you're moving to monthly cost versus an annual cost has been an interesting psychological shift. And then for some of our larger customers, we've, back to this, just give me the answer, solve the problem. We've been doing a lot more bundling where we sit there and say, okay, here's what the total cost is, and it has a TAM in it, it has these education things in it, it's got this product with this utilization, it's got, these different elements to it. And I think, all of those things are important as you scale to be able to be more agile. Because I do think the days are gone where it's just like you set pricing and then for the next decade, that's what it is.
Yeah. Are there sensitivities to supply chain risk, for example, if AWS were to drastically change pricing or costs or how they build you? Would that have an impact on your approach today?
Wouldn't impact us.
No? That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I would say from a Puppet perspective, I mean, we do leverage the public clouds in a distributed way for a variety of things, but they're not a meaningful cost in our bill of materials.
Fantastic.
It definitely is for us. So we're a very infrastructure-centric technology in the SaaS model. So the unit economics and the COGS are largely driven by our spend with the cloud providers. Now, interestingly, the infrastructure price drops have not actually, that the cloud providers have had, they haven't had that many recently, but maybe a couple of years ago, have not really led to customer pressure for us to do the same. So a combination of our volume of spend increasing across the cloud providers, plus the fact that we have leverage because we built the product in a uniform way across 3 cloud providers, so we have some leverage across them there, and the fact that I think customers value a database differently than commodity infrastructure, our margins actually expanded because of those 3 factors, so to a point where, yes, if they change their pricing in a fundamental way, it would have an effect on our business, but I think if they did that, they would have a much bigger problem in the grand war they're embarked amongst themselves that I don't think it's a meaningful risk.
Excellent. We've got a couple of minutes left, and so let's open it up to the audience and see if there are any questions. Just raise your hand if you have a question. We've got one in the back.
What are you eating, popcorn back there, Dharmesh?
I have a question regarding your developer-first strategy. When you moved from, or actually just hybrid movement from enterprise sales B2B strategy to developer-first strategy, what is one thing that just clicked, that worked? Or is there one thing that works?
Want to go first, or you want to take a crack? I wish I could say there was one thing. In many cases, the big advantage I think MongoDB had on this journey was that because it's open source, we have a massive amount of organic search traffic all hitting mongodb.com that's coming there to learn MongoDB, to learn about our products, or to download our open source software. Millions and millions of people do that. So in some sense, there was a set of built-up, pent-up demand that's hitting our website. And MongoDB was founded right around the same time Amazon Web Services was launched. So there's always been a massive amount of MongoDB deployed in the public cloud. Now, the shift was, as we started to move the web experience more and more towards a developer-centric kind of model, the mission of our core web property is now much more around being an e-commerce engine for our cloud business that's direct to developer. And that's had profound effects in the way we've structured marketing, the way our marketing budget has expanded to drive digital content marketing, all the different tactics that we have there, so that we could move that funnel from one order of magnitude to two orders of magnitude higher, because it's so much more important that we're constantly driving more traffic to the website. So it's not really like one thing. I think we were lucky to have an important ingredient, which is a lot of web traffic, and then use that to our advantage to turn that into a broad-based direct-to-developer e-commerce model. That's the biggest change in the company in the last few years.
Excellent. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Interesting insights. On the self-service channel, how are you measuring the productivity of the reps? And a related question, like there would be enterprise accounts where people would be coming in the self-service channel. Yeah. How are you going about handling the channel or the rep conflicts?
Yeah, so on the first question, there's a large segment of our self-service customers that actually have no human touch at all. So they are focused much more around in-product nurture, trigger-based email marketing, and then we've started to build out kind of a long-tail customer success function that's much more automated and data-driven based on product signals as opposed to a high-touch model, just because economically that would never work for a customer that's only spending a few $100s or a few $1,000s a month. In terms of where we have sales engaged, there are kind of two big things we've done to kind of avoid channel conflict. In a scenario where, whether it's an inside sales rep or an enterprise segment customer, if they come in through the self-service channel and upsell into a contract, a committed contract through sales, we only pay the reps on the growth of that annualized run rate. So in one sense, we don't have the reps cannibalizing healthy customers in self-service, right, and just sort of overpaying on commissions just to transfer them over, because we don't really value the commitment that much. Our expansion metrics are fantastic, so it's a minor point, not a major point. But at the same time, for the right customers, when sales gets engaged, they might be going from spending, we had a customer in one of our newer products that was spending $30 a month on a credit card and then signed a $95,000 contract the first time they engaged with sales. So we do want sales in the right accounts to be able to drive further, faster expansion. That's still there for most of the reps who are paid on bookings to manage that right behavior of when they should get engaged. On the inside sales side, one of the newer teams we've created, they're not actually paid on on bookings at all. They're purely paid on a run rate book of business of some of the lower or mid-range sort of credit card customers. So we will assign more of a territory model. They get a book of business of customers that they have to nurture and drive a growth rate of that cohort bigger than what we expect or faster than we expect on an organic basis. And that's a completely different model. So we're still sort of tuning and figuring that out. But in that case, the rep behavior is much more one of customer success than it is of like driving a deal and a commitment. And interestingly, I thought most of the reps' times in that model, that sort of consumption-based rep model, would be spent trying to drive expansion in the customer base. But what we've learned from that team, because they're so closely engaged with customers, is that they figured out how to identify potential churning customers ahead of time by looking at the monitoring metrics and the behavior. And it was one of those weird things where if they see a customer growing really, really fast, it used to be that if we didn't have all the optics, that'd be like, oh, that's a great customer, we should assign them to sales. And what it turns out is if a customer's growing too fast, it probably means they're using the product improperly. So they get the perception of the product's too expensive, which means they're either going to churn or they're not going to build the next new application on MongoDB. So we found that getting the reps engaged, getting them more product data in their hands, getting technical teams to support them to say, listen, you're doing this wrong. Let's get your spend to a tenable level. Not only makes that lifetime value for that individual app go much larger, but it also makes it tenable for the next step and the next step for the next step. So, that idea of moving from a renewal being a point in time when the contract's up to being constantly engaged with the customer is a big shift in just the way the people teams have operated.
I would say, I mean, I think what you're doing is phenomenal, and I think, you know, from a Puppet perspective, what we're doing is somewhat similar in the sense that, you know, there's a return on investment you need to get on your enterprise sales team. And so what we do is, you know, we've got very targeted accounts. We know what our ideal customer profile is. We know how many reps that we have. And so we allocate those to the richest lifetime value accounts. We have a customer success and a renewals team. They handle stuff. And if they see certain flags, you know, they'll bring in a rep, and we've got comp that makes it an incentive to do that. But for the most part, we don't want to distract our enterprise field with smaller SMB accounts that can be handled from the inside. And increasingly, as we build out our SaaS products, we're doing more product-led growth. And what's interesting and what we're trying to do is actually have the product-led growth be that land that ultimately can be capitalized on by the enterprise field rep. So kind of that same kind of blended approach across the three. And it's not a perfect science because you can't do it by company size or company revenue because there's always exception. But it's more, how do you think about the ideal customer profile for your buying behavior and lifetime value? And what we've learned to appreciate at Puppet is, you know, a lot of our biggest multi-million-dollar deals started off as 90, 100K. And then as we were getting ready, you know, 6-8 months ahead of the renewal, you know, you're going in there and you're finding success, you're finding that sponsorship, you're structuring that much bigger deal, and all of a sudden it's, you know, one of your key accounts.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's had big knock-on effects on how much we've had to invest in marketing operations and technology. You know, our lead scoring used to be, you know, 6 or 7 signals. That's firmographic information that matches our ideal customer profile, and now we have like, you know, 200 signals, half product, half external sources, machine learning, all this stuff, so that we can try as early in the funnel as possible to figure out which is the right customer to apply the right type of sales team to. And we're not fully there yet by any means, but that's been a big evolution. And to the point around like a large enterprise, you know, an account, one of the things we're finding is somebody can go start up you know, we have an account-based marketing program happening. Some developers go off, they start using the product on a credit card. The enterprise sales rep certainly wants to know that that exists, but they're carrying a, you know, $1 million plus quota. They can't necessarily be spending their time nurturing a $60 development environment that's just getting started. So now we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we make sure we have the right, perhaps inside sales reps or one of these consumption reps covering an enterprise account, nurturing some of these applications, and then creating the right incentives to pass it up to an enterprise rep when that application becomes something of scale or is interesting from a commercial perspective.
Yeah, as I say, the one thing that we just did in the last 2.5 months is we moved to revenue operations. So we took marketing operations, customer success operations, and sales operations, and integrated it all under a leader who's run a RevOps group before to have exactly what you said, that integration of signals across, because it's no longer clear boundary lines that will tell you what the right action is.
Just a quick question here. So I think a lot of people are thinking about this, but I'm going to put you guys on the spot anyway. Is this transition from on-prem, open source to cloud native such a good thing after all? I mean, just look at the numbers you talked about. 500 customers for Mongo making up a large chunk of revenue, and now you have 15,000 making up an equal chunk of revenue. So each on-prem customer pays you 30 times more. Is that right? 30 times? Yeah, 30 times more. As your existing customer does, or your cloud customer does. So at what point does it start cannibalizing it? At what point do you say, oh, the right thing is the cloud, but it's so painful, I want to slow it down, versus saying, I'm going to wholeheartedly embrace it. So how do you manage that cannibalization of the cash cow while you're making this cloud transition?
I mean, I'll take it. I think I'm a big believer that you should not try to hold back technology, but you should enable it. And if that means you need to cannibalize what you're doing, then you cannibalize what you're doing, because then you're winning in the next race. What I think is super important, at least in terms of our product roadmap and what we're doing, is that the hype around containers in particular, it's incredible. You think like everybody was 100% containerized. But the reality is, for our customer base, part of why they love and they bet on Puppet is we're not leaving them behind. We're not running away from the support that they need in their traditional node-centric environments. I mean, we just did a multi-million-dollar deal across 120,000 nodes, 3 data centers, and it's all brand new development. It's brand new servers. I mean, people are still investing in data centers at a slowing growth rate. And so for us, what's important, our customers are saying, hey, meet us where we are and take us where we need to be. So don't desert us. Don't do everything in the cloud and don't do everything containerized. But don't stay stuck in the past. And so what we've really focused on is that portability across. And we're even doing things like bringing some of the concepts of cloud native, which are DevOps, microservices, CI/CD, into our more traditional products. So with Puppet Enterprise, we have continuous delivery. You can do impact analysis. You can manage the pipeline in Puppet itself. And that helps the evolution of their talent pool. So when they do work in a more containerized environment, in a more cloud-native way, it's not foreign. So I'm a big believer in helping them actually accelerate their journey, but being really careful that I don't get so far ahead of them that I've left these people behind, because they need a lot of help and they're going to have traditional infrastructure for a long time to come.
I think we're at time. So Yvonne, Sahir, thank you for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.